I'm Mary Jo Childs, the designer and maker of the rug. Happy to see you. This mass-produced painting and this sheepskin in our newly decorated guest room were the inspirations for my rug. I wanted to create a welcoming room that made our visitors feel like they were in rural Vermont. So I decided I would make a rug with sheep in it for the adjacent bare wall using a palette that reflected the soft colors in the painting. I wanted the sheep to be up close and personal and felt the addition of lambs would create a heartwarming feeling. I combed the internet for photos of sheep, from which I made a collage using Photoshop. Then I contacted the photographers and received their permission to use their photos. Unfortunately, I never found the original source of the center ewe and nuzzling lamb. It was a photo used by several websites, none of which credited the source. Next, I traced the sheep in the collage onto paper, had it enlarged to fit the wall, and checked the scale in the room. Satisfied, I transferred my design to linen. I had not yet decided at this time if I was creating a group portrait or a landscape with sheep in it. I determined that I would need 9 values for the sheep fleece, from undyed white wool and light cream to beiges through to dark rusty browns. Then I quantified the area for each value and calculated the quantity of wool I would need before dyeing. I did not realize at the time that my darker values were too bright, for in reality, the depths of the sheep fleece would be more dull and grayish. This slide shows the dyed wool for the sheep fleece labeled by value. On the left are my dip dyes creating a gradient for the pinkish insides of the ewes and lamb's ears. Time to begin hooking. I started in the center so that I could determine if my values would work on both ewe and lamb. I quickly realized that the nose and mouth needed to be dark, cool colors, not dark but bright browns. I decided to be bold and try some aquamarine blue from my stash. I liked it. I used it on the eye stains as well. And for the fleece, instead of my newly dyed browns, I went to my stash and found some duller and darker grayish beige fabrics, so I used those for the depths of the fleece. I was learning a lot about color and value. The problem with the darker browns came up again when I chose to outline the ewe to visually separate her from her lamb. I used a value 8 brown wool and it was just too bold. It demanded the viewer's attention. So I experimented again using a medium value steel blue from my stash. It worked. It looked more like a shadow, a place where less light gets through. I continued with the fleeces, curly tufts with defined lines for the ewe and less distinct fluff for the lamb. When I had finished hooking the 3 central sheep, I felt I had to decide whether I was making a portrait of 7 sheep or a landscape with sheep in it. I used Photoshop's magic wand to select only the sheep, and then I experimented with various backgrounds. I absolutely loved the chocolate brown background were I to make a portrait, but the sheep looked imposing and judgmental, not the effect I wanted in my guest room. This showed me that I needed to set my sheep in a landscape that felt soothing and which drew the viewer into the background as well. I could also see that vertical grass using the aqua blues and pastel greens from the painting, along with some yellows for liveliness, provided some context for the sheep. The sheep with added shadows looked more grounded and more realistic. I then laid out the wools I had thought I'd use in front of the painting, arranging them in a rough approximation of where they'd likely go in a landscape background. The aqua greens and blues seemed harmonious, so I tried using them to create a grassy pasture in the foreground. I pulled some yellows and yellow greens from my stash to enliven it. A middle ground of beiges and soft golds would relate to the painting, and pastel aqua blues would define the sky. This slide shows some of the detail on the grass and the variety of colors and values of strips I used. including cuts 4, 6, 8, and some custom cut spear-shaped strips. I struggled with the shading on the sheep faces and fleeces a lot. The problem was that my photos of the sheep had various light sources. I kept having do-overs because I was trying to translate the photos as they were. I finally made a little sign with arrows showing where the light was coming from and pinned it to the upper right corner of the linen. This helped a lot, but I was relatively new to shading and I still had to pull out a lot of strips and rehook them until they felt right. The leftmost sheep was large, full-grown, and standing, so her body shadowed her legs. It was difficult to capture the colors of her shadowed legs. I tried using the number 8 value rusty brown again. After all, I had dyed it. And as you can see here, it was again too bold. I considered 3 options: the loud, dark, rusty brown, a duller grayish brown, and the same dull steel blue I had used for shadows between the fleeces of the other sheep. I tried the grayish brown alone and it was too blah, so I combined that with the dull steel blue. The mix of dull blue and grayish brown still seemed a bit too noticeable, so I posted a photo on the Facebook page for the Contemporary Rug Hooking group asking for opinions. Susan Feller, an accomplished artist and rug hooker, pointed out that the color of the grass, blue-green, would be reflected upward onto the legs. That made sense. I decided to leave it until later, knowing I could always change it, one thing I love about rug hooking. It turns out to have been good advice, and later I was happy with the effect. I finished hooking all of the sheep, pondering all the while what the background could be. I envisioned a pastoral setting like the Lake District of England, with fields crisscrossed by stone walls, backed by mountains and sky. I made a couple of sketches and consulted with my friend Penny Cunningham, a fiber artist with an eye for design, and she advised me to not make the background too busy. As I considered options, I remembered a favorite view of mine, the top of a hayfield on my husband's family farm in Chelsea, Vermont. I had recently tried to paint it. The hayfield at the farm would make a beautiful and meaningful background for me. This view faces west, so the sun shines from the south, the left side, and once again I would have to reverse the shadows, but I wanted this view as the background as is, and thus not flipped. Since I desired some golden beige middle ground like the inspiration painting in the guest room, I would convert the green middle ground to look like wheat straw that had been mowed and raked into rows. I love the look of windrows over hilly terrain as artist Sabra Field often creates in her prints. Penny suggested I delete some of the trees in the field to make it simpler. I did, and then decided to add a little barn to the tree line separating the middle ground from the background. It would speak to our big barn on the farm and make the eye travel back into the scene. The barn seems to add to the story by relating the sheep to the people who farm the land. With my background defined more clearly, I again staged the layers of color and values using wool I intended to hook. I thought hooking the windrows would be easy after the detailed hooking of the sheep. Silly me. The challenge was to create the texture of windrows without drawing undesired attention to them. I could also see that the little flower in the mouth of the right side lamp looked too stiff. I decided to make it droop in front of the fleece, creating more contrast. This allowed me to use a softer shade of purplish pink for red clover, Vermont state flower. I then added a few clover blossoms to the grass in the lower right corner. Back to the troublesome windrows. First, I resorted to painting canvases with various color combinations and realized they were all too loud. Next, I tried combinations of wool on some scrap linen and realized I needed similar values in soft, warm, golden beiges as in the upper right cluster in this slide. I had seen a rug made by Jean Shepherd which had diagonal lines of variously textured fields, and took his lead to use squiggles for texture rather than try realistic shadows to create the sense of rounded rows of cut grass. This was my first attempt at the golden windrose. The values and squiggles worked, but the field was too large an area of gold and it resulted in low contrast with the sheep. I pulled out the lower part of the golden field and rehooked it as green pasture grass. That brought the greens above most of the sheep, but it was too linear and too boring. I needed to create a higher contrast separation between the pasture and the golden mowed field. I laid out a tangle of strips from the green pasture and the golden mowed field and liked the contrast. This hedgerow created a more realistic end to the pasture and the beginning of the mowed field. The darkness created more depth and added subtle interest. So I pulled out most of the newly hooked green pasture grass and rehooked it using strips from the tangle to make a hedgerow. It worked. I also figured out which colors to use in the farther tier of mowing, which I wanted to be slightly duller since it was further away. The middle ground was separated from the background by a line of trees with shadows underneath to provide a defining line in the landscape. I had wanted to add some peach color, as in the inspiration painting, so I made the third tier of the hayfield peach and later pulled that out. It looked awful. I added some peach to a few of the trees, which I thought was weird at the time, but which added some interest in the end. I wanted the two large pine trees to provide high contrast with the sheep and create a heavy visual anchor on the upper left side. This would be balanced by a dark anchor of conifers and deciduous trees and their shadows on the right side. I hooked this pine tree 3 times. The first time it was too busy, with contrasting colors reaching too deep into the tree, and it looked two-dimensional, as shown here. The second attempt told me I needed more depth or darkness in the center, and even simpler clusters of branches. By the third time, with less contrast and bulkier branches, the tree felt right. I love those 2 trees now. The tree line on the right side was too busy at first. So using the edit function on my iPhone, I took a photo and painted over the tree line with simpler and darker foliage and dark shadows to relate to the dark greens of the pine trees. This combination would frame the rug on each side. It was easy to hook once I could see the effect I wanted. The curved dark line also draws your eye into the background and the barn. I had bought a beautiful piece of spot-dyed wool for this project early on that I had yet to use. It combined all the colors I desired for the rug in one piece of fabric, yet each time I tried to hook it, it just wouldn't work. When hooked, the colors seemed to merge to produce olive green, not a color that I wanted in my rug. So I went back to the dye pot for the umpteenth time on this project and created the blue-green forest using spot dyes for the nearest set of mountains. The 3 tiers of mountains would need values between the nearest mountains and the sky, so I overdyed some existing wool. For the sky, I had some leftover light aqua blue sky from a previous rug that would be perfect. I wanted to add Camel's Hump, an iconic Vermont mountain, in the farthest tier of mountains, but I feared that the color of the farthest mountain range would not provide enough contrast with the sky. By taking a black and white photo of the mountain and sky fabrics, I could see that the last tier of mountains was actually 2 values darker, so the subtle contrast would be there. Yay! So here I am after 4 years of work and with a lot more gray hair, hooking what I thought was the last few loops of sky in the last row. A final appraisal, however, revealed that the big, beautiful pine, which branched at the top into 5 parts, looked like spikes on a crown and screamed for a fix. Out went the loops of light blue sky, in went some dark green, and voila, it was done. One might think, to look at my rug, that a seasoned artist conceived it and hooked it. On the contrary, this rug was made by a person who merely had an end result in mind, to create a feeling of rural Vermont using sheep in a pastoral setting. I can see when something is not quite right, and I'm determined to fix it again and again till it feels the way I want it to feel. This rug also represents to me the friends who helped with comments and suggestions along the way and who nurtured my hooking interest over the years. Penny, Pamelia, Eva, and Jen. I appreciate them all. So here is my finished rug in our guest room with its sheep seeming to say, "Happy to see you."